which, when disengaged from its unhistorical wrappings, is judicious and profound. Now listen to what he says. He says, it says, for that the things which befell Israel under Jephthah, only the priests were to blame. Why did they not annul the vow of Jephthah? Why did they not restrain Ephraim from civil war? It is a manifestation that a truth is here suggested which applies to all times. It is undoubtedly the duty of persons equipped with spiritual power to lift up their voices for peace, and especially to labor for concord between the single tribe and all of Israel. If they neglect this duty, their candlestick. Basically what he's saying is, why did the priests not intervene with Ephraim? Why was there no spiritual leader? I mean, obviously we know that this time in history, Israel's history is very dark. But where were those who would stand up and say, wait a minute, this is wrong? Also, the Expositor's Bible Commentary on the volume of Judges and Ruth agrees with Lang. He says this, one may well ask, where is Ephraim's fear of God? Why has there been no consolation of the priest at Shiloh by the tribe under whose care the sanctuary is placed? The great Jewish commentary affirms that the priests were to blame, and we cannot but agree. If religious influences and arguments were not used to prevent the expedition against Gilead, they should have been used. So it's interesting that both commentaries point out the fault of whatever spiritual leaders there may have been in Israel at that time. But how much would it sting our own consciences if we ourselves as God's people would not try to squelch a rebellion or something that would come up in a church today? How many churches have been ruined on account of the rabble rising up against its leaders? But you know what? It's not just the rabble that's to blame. What of those who knew of their complainings and gripings, but never said a thing, but remained silent in that situation and let it happen? They're just as to blame as those who participated in the uprising. Now, back in Judges chapter 8, when Ephraim approaches Gideon, we see that one of Gideon's strong characteristics is kind of a mediator. He kind of soothes the Ephraimites at that time and assures them, hey, everything's going to be all right. And in fact, when you read the account in Judges 8, you see that the Ephraimites, it says their anger was dispersed. Their anger was calmed down because of Gideon's words. However, this was not the case with the Ephraimites and Jephthah. As I stated earlier, the Ephraimites had crossed over to go to war. Their intention was to fight. So in verses 2 through 4, we see Jephthah's response to an accusation and the ensuing battle that follows. So Jephthah responds to the Ephraimites, and he says, hey, I did call you guys, but you didn't come and help me. Verse 2, he says, Jephthah said to them, I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. Now, we're not told of the incident of Jephthah calling the Ephraimites to aid him in battle. However, we really don't have any reason to dispute the fact. In fact, the author simply just doesn't include the episode, probably because he was focusing on the event which was about to transpire. But Jephthah's statement to his kindred is actually somewhat telling. These are little subtleties, again, that we don't often see in the English language. Jephthah uses the word, I called you. I called you to come help. You go back to verse 1 to the Ephraimites. I believe the King James uses the words, they gathered themselves together. And some of the other translators uses the word call to arms, which I think that's probably a better translation. I believe here that the author of Judges is actually contrasting what's going on here. The two words which the Ephraimites were called to battle and Jephthah called them are actually two different Hebrew words, but they sound just alike, except but one letter, which stands at the front of each word. Both words used in verse 1 and verse 2 means a call to aid. while the Ephraimites were calling their fellow Ephraimites to aid them in war against Jephthah, verse 2 affirms for us that Jephthah was calling the Ephraimites to aid him against his enemy. So it almost seems that the author is contrasting these two incidents. Jephthah's words failed to persuade the Ephraimites. And in verses 4 and 5, we see the battle that takes place because of this. Verse 4 says, Then Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim. And the men of Gilead struck Ephraim because they said, You are fugitives of Ephraim, you Gileadites. You're in the midst of Ephraim and Manasseh. And the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. And when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, Let me go over, the men of Gilead said to him, Are you an Ephraimite? When he said no, they said to him, Then say Shibboleth. And he said Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they seized him and slaughtered him at the fords of the Jordan. At that time, 42,000 of the Ephraimites fell. So we learn in verse 3 that basically the Ephraimites accuse the Gileadites of being kind of a half-breed of Israel. They're not really Israelites. That's almost the charge they seem to bring. And something like this infuriates the Gileadites, and so they take the bait and go to war. Now Jephthah, being the seasoned warrior that he is, and his men being seasoned warriors, have no problem overtaking the Ephraimites. They easily conquer them, and then they do something kind of strategic. It says they capture the fords of the Jordan. Now the fords of the Jordan were like the main crossing point. And remember, the Ephraimites have crossed over the Jordan. They're out of their homeland. They're now on the east side of the Jordan, whereas their territory was in the west side of the Jordan. So by Jephthah and his men capturing the fords of the Jordan, what did that mean? That meant that now Ephraim, whom they had accused the Gileadites of being fugitives and basically half-breeds, now they were the ones away from home. They were the ones out of their home territory. It's very interesting that Ephraim, who had been the once proud Ephraimites, were now humbled. They had been chiefs in their own lands, and now they were fugitives without a home, leaving their wives and their children on the other side of the Jordan. I'm sure that the grief was more than they could bear. And I think the Gileadites knew this. And so they set up guards at the fords. And they gave them sort of a speech test, I guess you could say. And verses 5 and 6 give us that speech test. Whenever a person tried to cross the Jordan, they would ask them, Are you an Ephraimite? Oh no, not me. Okay. Say the word Shibboleth. And it tells us that they weren't able to pronounce the SH. So they would say Sibboleth. Now in Hebrew, you have a letter, two letters actually, it's called Shin and Sin. They both look exactly alike. Now back then, obviously, you didn't have vowel pointings. You didn't have vowels or all consonants. The Masoretes actually came up with a vowel pointing system in order to help read with the pronunciation of the vowels that belonged in the letters. So in in grammar textbooks of Hebrew, you'll see the letter Shin with a small dot over the right-hand side. When you see the small dot on the right-hand side, that indicates the SH sound. But when you see the dot to the left of it, it indicates just an S sound. And so, in fact, one letter actually became two in the Hebrew alphabet, pronounced two different ways depending on what word it was. So the Gileadites are aware that the Ephraimites can't pronounce this word correctly. Now, the word Shibboleth itself just means stream or river, which was actually kind of, I say ironic, but not ironic, considering that that's where they were at the Jordan River. The Ephraimite word Sibboleth simply means an ear of corn. And most of the commentators agree there's nothing significant about the words. It was just a test Variations of speech and dialect existed among the people of Israel. We can expect that just like here in our country. Same words, different dialects. People say them in different ways. So we're told that the Ephraimites were approached or given a speech test. And when they can't pronounce it, guess what happens? They're killed. And the bad thing about this is we read that 42,000 Ephraimites fell in this way. 42,000 people had their blood shed in this way. So what is the application that we can learn from here? The covetousness of the Ephraimites costed them dearly. Covetousness is a sin that is at the root of many other sins that we see. In fact, in Exodus 20, if we look at the list of the 10 Commandments, you shall not covet is actually the last commandment that's given. And if you look at all 10 of the commandments and go in ascending order back up, you'll see that covetousness can be at the root of every one of the violation of the 10 Commandments. For example, the 9th commandment says you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. What happens when we have a neighbor that we don't necessarily like, or one that is pesky to us or that bothers us? Oftentimes we may not think of it give it another thought, and may slander that person, that neighbor, to another person, bearing false witness against them, all because we coveted to end that peskiness of our neighbor. The 8th commandment says, you shall not steal. I don't think we have to look very far in this world to realize that covetousness causes people to steal. We see it all the time. The 7th commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Well, what is adultery? Other than the physical act, it starts with covetousness in the heart. Jesus himself said that if you look at a woman to lust, epithemeuo, it's the word to have a strong desire, then you've already committed adultery in the heart. When we covet someone who is not lawfully our spouse, we commit adultery. We break that commandment. The 6th commandment says, you shall not murder. Again, we don't have to look very far to see the results of covetousness. This is the height of covetousness, murder. We covet what somebody wants, and they can't get it by lawful means, so they kill them in order to take it. A fine example of this in Scripture is if you remember Ahab and Jezebel. And there was a man named Naboth that wanted to, or that he had a vineyard that Ahab wanted. But Ahab got upset because the guy wouldn't sell it to him. And so he goes on his bed and he's all weepy, and his wife, who's a wicked woman, Ahab was just as wicked, but he was really influenced by his wife, comes in and says, what are you babbling about? So Ahab tells him what's going on, and his wife says, look, you want the vineyard, I'll take care of it. She finds a couple people to bear false witness against the neighbor, and has this man killed, stoned to death. And then Ahab takes over the vineyard. There is the violation of the 10th and the 8th commandment, or the 6th commandment, in the same breath, coveting and murdering. 5th commandment says, you shall honor your parents. Now, how does covetousness play into effect here? Well, think about when a child is asked to do something by their parents. But yet the child in rebellion thinks that he or she wants to spend that time doing something else. They desire that independence from parental authority. They covet their own time. They see their own time as more valuable than what mom or dad would have that child to do. Therefore, that covetousness causes them to violate the commandments of honoring their parents. The 4th commandment says, you shall remember the Sabbath